I'm Susan Puisan-Locke. I'm a professor in contemporary art and director of the Decolonising Arts Institute. Thank you for joining us this late afternoon, early evening for this conversation between Professor Gargi Bhattacharyya and Professor Paul Goodwin about violence, survival, and shifting racial capitalism. I also want to thank our Institute and Centre colleagues, Claire Pattenden, Laura Kwamar, Claire Lowther, and Tim Lunadorni for organising this event. Before we begin, a couple of quick housekeeping notes. Please be aware that we're recording this event in case you haven't clocked the camera and the tripod in the middle of the room. We'll be sharing the recording in due course on the Institute YouTube channel. And secondly, in the event of a fire alarm, which we're not expecting, the fire exit, for those who don't know, are out this way, along the corridor, down the stairs, and the meeting point is Tate Britain. My role this evening is very simple, to introduce our eminent colleagues, Gargi and Paul, and I will then hand over directly to Gargi, who will share a presentation before Paul joins us to open up the conversation. There will be time for questions from the audience, which Paul will moderate, and then we'll wrap that conversation up around 7:15, after which we invite you to stay on for some drinks and refreshments. If you are desperate for liquid refreshment, hydration, we have some water there at the back. We don't want to see anyone passing out in this weather. So, without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Gargi Bhattacharyya, who joined the Decolonising Arts Institute last September as Professor in Anti-Post and Decolonial Praxis. Gargi, this September, will be taking up a new post as UCL Director of the Sarah Parker Remond Centre for the Study of Racism and Racialisation. And we want to congratulate Gargi on this prestigious move. While this is sad news for us, I'm happy to say that Gargi will remain affiliated to the Institute as a visiting professor for the next 3 years. And we really look forward to building on the emerging partnerships and developing cross-institutional collaborations between UAL and UCL. Gargi's work focuses on questions of systemic inequality and injustice and processes of imagination and collaboration that seek to navigate, bypass, and overturn such structures. Their work has contributed to debates in the fields of racism and anti-racism, gender and sexuality, and workplace rights, militarism, austerity, and racial capitalism. They have written numerous influential books, and among which are the most recent Rethinking Racial Capitalism, We, the Heartbroken, and the Futures of Racial Capitalism. I want to say that Professor Paul Goodwin needs no introduction. You're more familiar with Paul, but perhaps a longer one is needed than what I actually have. Paul is UAL Chair of Contemporary Art and Urbanism and Director of the Research Centre for Transnational Art, Identity and Nation, also known as TRAIN. He's a curator and researcher and educator whose research focuses on Black British art and African diaspora art since 1980 and transnationalism in contemporary art production. He was collaborator, co-conspirator on the BAM project, Black Artists and Modernism, and is currently co-lead investigator with Professor Ming Tiampo of the international research project Worlding Public Cultures, which is funded by the Transatlantic Platform for the Social Sciences and Humanities. Paul is also founder of TRACE, the Transnational and Transcultural Arts and Culture Exchange Network, and recent curatorial projects include W.E.B. Du Bois, Charting Black Lives, which was in London and Amsterdam, the stunning We Will Walk, Art and Resistance in the American South at the Turner Contemporary. And I feel it's really important to mention the earlier projects at Tate, which have had such huge impact, Migrations, Journeys into British Art in 2012 and Thin Black Lines in 2011. I think that's enough from me. Please do join me in welcoming Gargi and Paul with a round of applause.
Right. Thanks so much for coming. I know it's boiling hot, and hopefully it won't remain so uncomfortably hot while we speak, and soon we'll go and get a drink. Yes. A lectern, of course, is... Something like that. Yeah, it's a lectern. It's slidey, isn't it? It's like a trick. Okay, I'm going to just go ahead and talk for a while. Forgive me if people have heard this stuff before. I'm aware that I give far too many talks, and some people see me in different places and see different episodes of kind of what is the bigger thing. But we thought it just might be helpful without wishing to patronise anyone, to just say, who the hell is this person, Gargi? What is it they work on? And then so the conversation might make a bit more sense to you. So I am increasingly the UK auntie of racial capitalism, but when people can't afford the plane fare for a yank, they have me. And I'm happy with that role. But because there is so much quite shallow talk about racial capitalism, I just thought I'd say a few words about it. It really is not a conceptual framework about how capitalism is racist. I did an event a few weeks ago where someone got their knickers in a twist, really, about saying, no, it's just about this. No, it's not about that. It is about saying that there's a constitutive role of racialised and other arbitrary divisions in the reproduction of capitalism. That's not the same as saying that capitalism does racist things, although it may well do. And it's not the same as saying that every capitalist society we've ever seen is racist, although that may also be the case. The framework of racial capitalism is about saying that racism does something for capitalist reproduction, but capitalism can't remake itself in the ways that we've known without squatting in the divisions of racialized difference or other similar, parallel, arbitrary divisions between human beings. So it's not really a way of thinking about, I've said social relations, that's not quite the right word here, but it's not really about what people think. It's not EDI. It's not going to come up in, you couldn't have, or should have a policy against racial capitalism in this organisation. It's not that kind of thing. I'm not going to run an awareness-raising workshop and put it out of business. It's not that kind of analysis. It's saying, let us understand what work racism does in restructuring the economy again and again. And so partly I'm interested in it because it's an opportunity for me, and that's why I started working in this area, to stop banging on about attitudes, intolerance, how people feel, aversive racism, all the things that in this country and in many other countries takes up all of the airspace when we try and talk about the violence of racism. As if, find those bad racists, give them a good telling off. This is not that kind of theory. Instead, I hope it's a way of thinking differently and more seriously about when and where fast slave violence occurs. And I'm going to have to be speedier than this, and the clock hasn't come on right. That wasn't it good? Okay, well, so this bit you may already all know, but just in case, Paul said you do better say this bit, so. Right. This is the very beautiful, very eminent, multi-talented Cedric Robinson, who very belatedly late in his career, and actually quite shortly before his death, was suddenly really fated for being one of the people who popularized the concept of racial capitalism. Not the only one, but certainly from a US perspective and in terms of the global reach. There's another almost simultaneous and in some ways more formative debate that happens in apartheid South Africa. I'm not going to talk about that here today. I might be able to say a little bit about it if you want me to talk about it later. But my own work builds on the work of Cedric Robinson, not because I want to do a fine textured reading of what he really, really meant. It's a new industry stemming up about that. What did Cedric Robinson really mean when he said this? But more in a suggestive way to think about other events. And the three things I take from Robinson's work, which is really a small aspect of a big book he writes called Black Marxism, The Making of the Black Radical Tradition, that first comes out in 1983, at a time when it's not such a lot of friendly audiences for that kind of writing, either across people who work on race and racism, and certainly not people who worked on Marxism and capitalism. So it's kind of ploughing a quite lonely furrow at that time. And alongside the major part of the book is charting what the Black radical tradition is and how we might think of that as a tradition that combines the political, the cultural, the organisational, that thinks of spaces of insurgent agency in unlikely places. But what he says about Marxism, or what I take as the rereading of Marxism for my own purposes, are these three big things. One, that rather than making us all the same, capital differentiates us further. The reason why that's important is that one of the great promises of one reading of Western Marxism was the idea that it doesn't matter if you worship different gods, or you're men and women and others, or you've got racialized differences, capital will make you all interchangeable. And that's how we'll become one unified class subject. That you might all be different, but as we all become proletarianized, we are just interchangeable. The differences between us will wash away because capital must homogenize us. Robinson says, you know what, I'm not sure that really holds out when you look historically. That doesn't feel like what's been going on. He doesn't talk about some of the work that comes after 1983 about uneven development. He's kind of anticipating that. He says, actually, capital remakes itself by proliferating the differences between us. So that's one thing. It's kind of like interesting, because then you need to think, well, how are we going to unmake this thing if we're not all going to just automatically all become the same and one big class family? Alongside that, he says, whatever we might hope for, there's not one trajectory of capitalist development or class struggle. I always say, look, I'm kind of a bit raised in these traditions. The Indian left is not very freewheeling and flexible about how this analysis of capitalism works. But he is saying that idea that there's only one set of stages that every society goes through, in which eventually you become industrialised in a certain way, everyone becomes an interchangeable proletarian, class struggle happens, freedom is around the corner. It's quite hard to match onto events as we have known them. So he says, look, there's not one story, there's lots of stories. Capital remake itself in lots of different ways. Societies will pass through many different formations. Not everyone will become an industrialised, so-called industrialised society that is on the edge of revolution in that way. And because he's interested in those two things, he says this other thing, which is, well, then how do we think about the anti-capitalist agent? Those first two big stories, the idea that despite ourselves and itself, capital will make us into each other's comrades. One day I'll wake up in industrial work and so will you, and we'll have an automatic class consciousness with each other. And then the stages of history will lead us to the revolutionary showdown with the bourgeoisie. If both of those things need a bit of reframing, then we need to think about who is the anti-capitalist agent. And he says, well, you can't just rely on structure. Some people are writing as if he is an apologist for capitalism, but he's still in the anti-capitalist tradition. He's just saying you have to look in different places. He says, well, look in the Black radical tradition if you want to really see vibrant, effective, and successful anti-capitalist struggles. And he looks at the Haitian Revolution and things. He says, and look, that's not just made through a structural moment in the economy. It's made through culture, commonality, the ability to articulate yourselves together with others as people who overthrow things. Okay, I better hurry up because now I've taken thought for ages. Right. Why am I interested in it? This is what I write about. I'm not a historian, so I'm interested normally in the present and the just coming future. And I always try and say that I think racial capitalism is best understood as a question, not as a meta theory, not as something that boxes off all the edges, but as a question about why solidarity is so elusive, particularly as it's the same beasts that are wrecking all of our lives. In fact, nearly everybody across the globe is not living to their potential. If all of us are living in sorrow, maybe variable sorrow, and it's capital that's doing it, why is solidarity so elusive? So moving to a framework of racial capitalism allows me and others to think about that question, not as a matter of will or even ideology. There's still, even now you hear as if only we could bring people together, they'd see each other and we'll do some multicultural stuff, and then the veil will fall from their eyes and people will be all as one. But instead saying people are not in solidarity with each other because the material structures of their lives confound that solidarity. Sometimes they confound it because you don't even see each other. I think London is like that. So there's a whole parallel economy of people who ride the bus at 4 a.m. and then have left the building by 7 a.m. Then the day shift comes in, and there's a whole kind of parallel economy of where people live and shop and who lives 10 to a room in a bunk bed and who doesn't. And so that it's not ill will that means that there's a lack of solidarity between people living that kind of precarious life and the slightly different precarious life of people who are documented, people who might have citizenship, people who might have a precarious but daytime job. But there's also something geographical about where people do their work, where they can live, where they can come together with others.
Right.
And that's at the heart of how racialized division motors capitalist reproduction. So those things mean, alongside these two other interests that I have, that you can't just wish ourselves free. You have to look at why our unfreedoms are similar and yet not quite not in sync with each other. So the other two things I write about are social reproduction. There's not only students in the room. I was going to give a whole thing about social reproduction is this, so social reproduction is how you remake human life. It means both how we remake the species and how we remake our bodies every day. It used to be talked about mainly as housework, but increasingly people understand that social reproduction stems far beyond housework, although it always includes housework, and that how we're able to remake our lives, that's also like racialized. That, some of the South African stuff talks about how under the apartheid regime, there was a scraping of value from the back home spaces of African communities, so that the wage is not enough to reproduce the family. But because they know people are going back to the homeland, that some of the work of social reproduction also reproduces capital. So I'm interested in that, how that happens now. And I'm also interested in how we think about the highly escalated battle for the means of life in this time of climate catastrophe. If we thought solidarity was hard before, oh my word, look at what's coming next. Or just coming already, it's not even next, is it? Look around us, look how hard it is to imagine both our survival and the rights of all others. Right, need to hurry up a lot. Okay, I'm now going to rush through the next bit. I was going to say something about the past. I've been saying this for ages. Lots of new work about racial capitalism. I'm happy that loads of people are working on it. And you'll start working on a thing and you don't know, then suddenly everyone else is working on it secretly in their room, and all these books come out at the same time. Oh, I was thinking about that. A lot of the work that's being done, especially in the States, is looking backwards. It's looking at the historical formations of especially American capitalism, of what plantation economics was, why that's central to how all American economic development has taken place. I also think there's something a little bit difficult about how easily the term racial capitalism slips off your tongue. Makes it sound like, oh, that's the answer to everything, doesn't it? I felt like that when I first heard it. Oh yeah, that puts everything in the same box. I think we've failed if we read history as a confirmation of the inevitable victory of the powerful. That's what it means when we say, that history is written by the victorious, the powerful right history. Is it sounds like their victory is just the only thing in town. When we look backwards, I think we need to find ways to see every outcome as contingent. The rulers are the rulers because they won the last round, but we need to kind of learn the cracks of how they got to that place. Which leads to today. The picture that's rubbed out there is a Crusades picture, which probably was interesting. It's a picture about the end of the Crusades when a town who thought that they were too wealthy to ever be ransacked and let fall apart. Why? Which feels like a metaphor for our time. Racial capitalism describes the manner today in which apartheid, dispersal, disentitlement and disposability are integrated into the process of accumulation. And the point is that these things become productive or an opportunity. They're not a mistake. That is not only business as usual, it's an asset to business as usual. The outcome of that is that first, the terms of our survival, so I've got the grammar on, double check this here, the terms of our survival become decoupled from the survival of some others. That's what I mean about climate crisis further confounding the ability to find solidarity. That when we think about the struggle to stay alive anywhere on the planet now, which is an urgent struggle that many people are losing, the manner in which that can be imagined really makes it hard to link it to the survival of others elsewhere, or maybe others in the same space. So that's one thing that I think is happening. And as we've seen increasingly, and I said at the last COP was pretty open about this, that the remaking of capitalism is openly prioritised over the survival of some people. As a framework, racial capitalism offers us a framework to understand who might be included in that some, which some people. So what I've been trying to do, it's not time to say this, I'll hurry up. It's like I said, taste the particularity of the moment. I think that's something multidisciplinary about what does this moment taste like? And there's two things I'm interested in. One is a shift in the patterning of process of accumulation, and one is this ramping up of some state practices as others fade and disappear. And the four big things that I've tried to think about in the book that came out last year, which of course means I was writing it ages ago. I can't remember what was in it at all. So by the time a book comes out, that's 3 projects ago by the time it comes out in the world. But I tried to think about these 4 things, and people might have other thoughts about them. One is about bordering. I think it's almost doesn't need explaining that bordering is one of the key techniques of racial capitalist ordering in our lifetimes. What I'm interested in is the ways in which bordering, as we come to see it in the 21st century, is less and less an individual national project and more a collaborative project between nations, causing non-spaces between spaces of national sovereignty, where people are left to die on the edge, on the border, in the corridor, in the wasteland. That's a shift. I'm calling that a renewed global class war. I don't know how else to understand it. Alongside that, carcerality. People have been writing about prisons for decades, quite rightly. I'm not sure that it's not a new thing to say, but just to alert ourselves to the ways in which, as the economy changes within nations and globally, and people are dispersed by lack of access to the means of life, there's a ramped up and dispersed carcerality that is, I think, the closest analogy I have is that it's a kind of regime to discipline recalcitrant humans, and then I've called it a new age of vagabondage. That Marx talks about the age of the vagabonds in the prehistory of capitalism. That people don't want to become workers. It's like happily living my life, eating when I can. So people say, oh yeah, it's time for work. People quite rightly say, F off, I'm not doing that, run away. A lot of that part when Marx talks about primitive accumulation, some of it's about law as well, is the kind of violence you have to enact on humans to make them do anything to stay alive. Mark them physically, raise their homes to the ground, contain them, corral them. I think we're seeing a terrible new parallel to that. And alongside that, sorry, I know I've gone over, I'm going nearly done. Only one more after this. Why people are so vulnerable to that. One, I think, is that wage work, which was meant to save us all, is increasingly a minority sport across the globe. Certainly standard work, very much a minority of the world that has stable standard work. That means the work that you know will carry on, that fulfills, that you can meet your economic needs through, that's full-time. I think on last reckoning, IMF and World Bank thought only about a quarter of the world does that. So what are the other 3/4 of us doing? Something different. One thing we're doing is taking on a load of debt at all levels. So that's, I think debt is a more widespread economic experience than wagedness, and that changes our relation to capital. And some of that then becomes reshaped again by the ascendance of platforms. I haven't got time really to talk about it here, but if you look at the wealth of companies, the power of companies, it's pretty clear that platform corporations are the one that are in the ascendance in our time. And that's lots of work being done about how we work for platforms. But the thing that I'm interested in is that if platforms are the ascendant form of corporation, just as car manufacturers and mass production the ascendant form of corporation in the early 20th century, we need to think about what that means for human life. Now, the infrastructure to maintain human life we have is from a different kind of economic model. And I think there's increasingly a mismatch between the infrastructure required to remake capital as platforms and that required to remake human life. I'll try and write. So the end is, he took away, I had an ugly picture of Richard Branson flying into space. Yes, it's fair enough. But no, his ugly face. Right. In common with many others, everyone who knows, I found it very hard to carry on for this last 9 months. I'm not sure what kind of conversation you can have about racial capitalism when the powerful of the world show you so clearly every lesson. But I also don't know a way to plan our resistance or our revenge apart from seeking to understand the world. In this context, I think of the lessons of racial capitalism not as a prescription, not as a manifesto, not as a set of things to do, but as a set of clues about how the owners of the world conduct themselves. Because it needs our curiosity to see how shonky and on the hoof the impositions of the powerful are, not finessed, not tactical genius, not inevitable. It's always a struggle, but the future's not decided, not yet. That's what I'd like to talk about.
Want to? Not at all.
Right. Sorry, bad time picking and a hot drink already before the nonsense.
So Gargi, thank you so much for that wonderful kind of précis, all too short of your work, which we can go into a little bit the conversation. I mean, it's been a long time since we've seen each other.
Yeah.
And we haven't, probably that, something like that.
I'm not sure.
And I haven't seen you since you joined UL, and it's great to see you in person. But I'm also really sad that you're leaving at the same time as Susan said. But glad to hear that you'll still be in contact with us and working through those things. So my first contact with the concept of racial capitalism is through Cedric Robinson and through the Black radical tradition, Black Marxism, which at that time was, for me, sort of blew my mind. And I think you hinted at that, but I remember at that time I was focused probably in the late 80s when I read it. Or not all of it, by the way. It's a very difficult, long book, but I did read most of it. I was attracted, to be honest with you, I focused much more on the Black radical tradition and the space that opened up within Black studies, as opposed to the intricacies of how he critiques Marxism, which is very important, as you mentioned, And it's interesting to see how in the last few years, well, since at least 2020, with the rise of Black Lives Matter globally, etc., as you've said, racial capitalism it's really come through in movements and people are using it. Many artists now are also working with that in their work and making work that addresses explicitly questions of racial capitalism. And it's also, part of it has gone hand in hand with a renewed interest in Black studies and the new Black studies of people like Christina Sharp and Saidiya Hartman, etc., Black feminism, etc. So I just wondered, I wanted to start with thinking about how you kind of hinted at it, how you situate yourself within that, within the ways that it has been taken up most recently by many of these movements. Because in some of the things that I've read and I've heard that you've said, is that you're perhaps a little bit uncomfortable or critical of some of the way that it's been used, perhaps in terms of an overdetermination of identity, rather than actually focusing on what I think, as you mentioned, what Cedric Robertson was actually trying to say about differentiation of capitalism, how difference is at the heart of capitalism. So maybe you could say a bit more, maybe you could start by saying a bit more about your responses to some of the ways that it's been used in recent times. You alluded to the scholarship that's come out about that. I must admit, I've read less of that, but in terms of the way it's been mobilized, particularly by young people, artists, cult activists, etc., it's become, as you say, a buzzword. So what's your kind of reaction to that, and what do you think is the way that we should be thinking about that?
Okay, no, thanks so much. And it has been 30 minutes. Anyway.
Long time.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think I'm not saying I'm critical of ways people are using it. I think the most exciting thing about the framing of racial capitalism is that the debate is really motored from the street. That's why it matters. That's why it kind of doesn't matter if some people write stuff that you don't love, because it has a life, because it still has a life in movements. And I think the life it has in movements is as exciting as any political moment I've lived through, because it's the taking of the most radical edge of anti-racist, anti-state organising, which is also in my political history in this country. And it takes that and it says, when we talk about systemic racism, let's talk about which system we're talking about. It's extended the engagement of especially people a lot younger with me, with a much broader range of anti-capitalist politics. And anti-capitalist politics is not captured by the sour-faced old white blokes who I had to hide from for most of my political lifetime. It's enabled people to organise around local issues of violence and disentitlement in a way that can still span what I would call an internationalism, but also cross-issue organising. So I think that's the breathlessness. As with everything, it's tricky, isn't it? We live in a world where ideas are not seen to matter much, but the only place ideas can matter is the United States, because that's a bit like television or something. So I think that's not the fault of any individual. It's not the fault of scholars who we might even know and like or work with. But there's something about the spectacularization of US intellectual life against any other attempt to have any idea, which I think is a problem for everyone, including them. But that's a slightly different thing. It's not in the work itself. And I think it's a continuation of the spectacularization of black bodies, actually. You can see it, can't you, and how people are invited. Oh, let's come and suffer for us now. Stop the writing.
Yeah. And we spoke about people like Ash Sharma, who is a common friend and colleague also at UL, who, along with Danveer, has kind of written kind of against the way that American Black Studies has sort of shaped the debate, and was kind of argued for looking, as you say, more at local conditions. I guess the other thing I was interested about in terms of racial capitalism and the way that you framed it is, there's a really strong focus in the Futures of Racial Capitalism and in Rethinking Racial Capitalism, about the changes and the way that capitalism shapeshifts. It's like a beast. You call it a beast or a monster that continually changes. And I think in one lecture that I watched on YouTube, you talked about it as a bit like the Terminator, where it kind of like becomes liquid, and it just keeps coming back and reshaping itself, right? So my question is, maybe you could talk a little bit about that and what kind of shape shifting it's happening now. You talk about that in the book, but also, what about race? How is the race in racial capitalism shifted, right? Because the race in racial capitalism is shifted along with the different forms that capitalism has taken. Maybe we could just say a bit about how those things have shifted.
No, you're quite right that the thing that keeps me up at night is how the other side are always 3 steps ahead of us. And just as we're trying to get a little bit of a space to live in from the harms of the past, and some new violence is coming. I feel like that's been my whole lifetime, and feels like it's escalating. I can't have it. You feel like things escalate as you get older, and just things actually getting quicker. So yeah, I am interested to work with others to try and spot how capital adapts its techniques, and also to just be open to anticipating that the world might not get better, but it might be horrible in slightly different ways, because I think that requires an attentiveness from us. I actually think British cultural studies is based in that tradition. I think that's, the whole CCCS model was about, it's always crisis, but the crisis will hurt you differently. So that's one thing I'm interested in. In terms of race, this is tricky to say, because I should stop saying it, but I wonder if some of our habits of thinking about race might not fit so well in a reformulated global capitalism. Or maybe they'll have residues, but maybe new forms of equally deadly violence around arbitrary status are already emerging before us. Just saying that is not enough, is it? But I feel like first thing to just say that, because otherwise so much work around race in this country, especially in institutions like universities, becomes formulaic, doesn't it? We know what racism is, we know it's bad, we say the same thing, we say it's still racist, and we go around the circle again. Whereas at the same time, the thing that's really going to kill you is coming over the hill, and they're not even ready.
Is that because the racial thinking, in the way that, say, Paul Goodwin talks about it, is still tied to raciology, to that kind of history of a morphological understanding of race? And obviously it's shifted towards cultural ideas of racism. I'm just wondering is that what you mean in terms of that race doesn't, the way that we think about race doesn't quite match the way that the forms of racism that...
I mean, not only that, because I think morphology can adapt. Morphology is adapted in my lifetime in this country. And you can't live in a major city in Britain and not know that people have learned to read bodies differently in this 40 years.
Yeah.
Including what differentiations within the so-called black body and so-called brown body and so-called white body and mixtures in between. But so I don't mean because otherwise it feels like a stupid non-fighter saying, you still believe in raciality, whereas I believe in platforms. I'm not saying that, but I am saying that as well as the long legacy of old established forms of raciality, quite innovative forms of dispossession, sometimes absolute dispossession, can go alongside or on top and shift things around. And that if we're going to make it, we need at least the language to talk to each other about.
Yeah. And one of the things that I really appreciate about your definition, or the way that you talk about racial capitalism, is the fact that it's not just about denunciation. The way we use it's not just about the bad, the obvious evil that it does. There's also investments that we have in racial capitalism, which helps it to reproduce itself. And if you could say a little bit about those investments and is that the reason why racial capitalism refuses to kind of die and keeps reproducing itself?
Well, capitalism is going to kill itself, whatever we wish. So that's one thing. But I think this is the bit that I wish I'd had I couldn't say more than what I said, but I would like to talk to other people about. And I tried to explain it, but I think even as people face racism, it's very hard for us not to be in love with our racialized selves. Rightly. How can we make it otherwise? That we must be in love with ourselves, and that is our racialized selves. And therefore, how we think of the pleasure of ourselves is within that.
Does that sound a little bit like false consciousness? That, we've got a false consciousness, race is a form of false consciousness, which sounds like an old argument, which I'm sure you're not arguing, but it feels like a little bit like that. What do you mean?
Yeah, I don't mean that. Firstly, I don't think that I have a real self outside my racialized self, however constructed race is. And that I think whatever the technology of race is, it is not only an external imposition, it is also properly a technique of self, which means that it is an entry into the social, including for those who are racially subordinated. And that, I don't know, the element of being in love with yourself that is required to survive, that, that different people have tried to theorise outside of race altogether. You can't just throw that away. That it isn't an ideological argument. It's a subject formation argument, and it's about and it's also a relation to the body argument and a relation to others argument. And I don't know about this, but I wonder in a time when we are more dispersed than ever, and other forms of collectivity and spatialised collectivity are disrupted differently, if the discourses of race and the actual practice of being with others as a racialized person, whether they're people like you or people unlike you, might be one of the trace remnants of what collective living and feeling good about yourself and others might be like. That's why I think people are in love with their racialized selves. I think we have to work with that.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things as well that I get from your work, and that you often, I think, talk about, is the totalizing nature of racial capitalism as a concept. That it covers everything. And you've also kind of hinted at in some of your work in the new book, Futures of Racial Capitalism, about a racial capitalism without racism, that somehow we can kind of move beyond the horizon of perhaps that racial thinking that we see as central to racial capitalism. In that sense, where are we moving towards a racial capitalism without race, or does racial capitalism not quite capture what capitalism is evolving into?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. So I tried to say at the end that because people quite rightly say it, that talking about racial capitalism can make you really invested in the racial in ways which I think are difficult, that stop you thinking beyond the horizon.
Yeah.
And also, capital is a tricky beast. That you would have thought it was impossible for capital to remake framings of gender in the way it has done in my lifetime. When I first started to be educated, certain ideas about what gendering was and who it could make you were seen as impassable. That's the only way that capital will make itself. Actually, look around you. Everybody makes that quite happily. It doesn't matter. As our friend Sita says, doesn't matter. Capital doesn't care about your polycule. Doesn't give a two F's about it. Mm-hmm. But it does care about reproducing itself in a way that the value of your life belongs to it, not you. Mm-hmm. So within that, I think there are ways in which there might be other forms of differentiation that we don't know the name of yet. Maybe citizen and non-person will become it. Maybe it's already overlaid with what race is in our time. Maybe other new forms will around even deeper climate catastrophe, in which war zones and zones of climate catastrophe increasingly make large parts of the world unlivable, which already this year you can see, then that opens a new possibility of sifting, which might not throw out raciality, but might not be contained within the terms of raciality alone. So that, I think, should they say that to each other?
Yeah. Talking about climate catastrophe, which I think is a very important part of your work and your kind of understanding of racial capitalism, I wanted to kind of just talk a bit about violence and how, because violence runs a theme throughout all of the works that you work on this subject, and it's sort of central to the operation of racial capitalism and the way that it impacts us in differential ways. And one of the things that I think is becoming increasingly apparent with things like what's happening in Gaza, and also with, as you say, climate refugees, etc., is the dehumanization that it entails. And I wondered if you could just say, in the way that it renders human beings to become expendable resources, right? And also you talk about in the book, this idea, and you mentioned it in the talk, bordering incarceration and debt as forms of social violence. I wonder if you could say a little bit about how these forms of, these really important aspects of racial capitalism manifest themselves as violence in our everyday lives. It's a big question.
Yeah. It's not, it's nothing new, is it? Capital comes dripping with blood from every pore. That capitalism is about stealing our life force from a machine that is not sustaining our lives. So it's based on violence. Lots of the work around the decolonial and around racial capitalism has looked to broadening the framework of how we think about how we come to this moment, what we think the emergence of capitalism was, what we think the rise of the West was, why we think some places are developed economies and some places are not. But all of that is based on violence, dispossession, mass murder, capture. It's open. That's an open secret. That's no longer something that we hide from. What we perhaps need to say to each other a little bit more explicitly, or what I think the conversation I hope more and more people are having is about how, alongside that very explicit mass murder end of violence, all of the other ways in which capitalist remaking happens, especially at a global level, are about the stealing of life force. And as you say, gradations of expendability. The lesson is everyone is expendable, but the accommodations for you not to be expendable today, and some of the dehumanization about that. I also don't, I know other people do, I don't really subscribe to an idea that there are, I don't really subscribe to ideas of white privilege or things like that. I think the kinds of violent disciplining of racially subordinated groups of people is always a warning to those who are not yet racially subordinated, that it's it's sweeping up the beach. If it's not swept over your family yet, it's kind of saying, watch your step, because we can do this to you. And I think whatever the kind of ructions of different electoral processes across Europe right now, I think even white people think that. They think, even if they say it in a racist way, some of them, they're kind of saying, all of the ideas about replacement or loss of greatness are about saying, being white sucks, God, it wasn't meant to be like this. What kind of white privileges? They haven't got anything. That's what they're saying, isn't it? And so that's saying, oh, look, the violence of racial capitalism is coming to your door. Once I've killed all these people, your kids next.
We have about 5 minutes left, told, and I've still got quite a few questions, but I will break them down to 2 questions. One is about survival, which you talk about. And I think the key question that you ask is, how do we survive together, right, in racial capitalism? And I think the politics and geographies of the everyday is quite important to that. And I just wondered, particularly since your time here in the art school, whether you'd given any thought to what role art practice, making could play within this within this kind of, with our sense of survival, at the same time acknowledging the role that art plays in the neoliberal project, right? So and I know that your first discipline was literature, and you talk in your writing, you talk about them, I think you moved away from thinking about representations. We talked about this, too. So I just wondered what your engagement in the work or in your thinking about racial capitalism is with creative processes and the question of survival.
Well, this is all embarrassing, isn't it? Because I came and was leaving almost immediately, and I'm sorry about that. I would not have gone for any other job apart from the job I'm going to. But when I came to UAL, I did say it quite, in my interview, and I still think it, that rather than, I don't come from a practice background, and I strongly do not believe that individual practice makes any difference. So, that's for fun. I'm fine with having fun. I do stuff for fun. But I do think that the model of making as a collaborative process and a model of knowing, understanding and changing the world through a collaborative creative process in which no one actor can do the task is a model for what survival for all of us can and maybe can only be. So when I talk about survival, I don't mean like, living in racial capitalism, but let's have a cocktail and a massage. It's not like well-being. I'm saying let's survive racial capitalism because the world is on fire. We must make a different world. And the making of a different world is a collaborative, creative practice. Some people have, I said it in my interview, we are not going to argue our way out of climate catastrophe. The other party is not waiting for me to make my closing speech and then say, oh, no, actually, it's a great argument. I think I'll stop doing that. We have to make a different world, which is a different set of multiple intellectual practices. And I really hope that I'll work with more people on about that.
That leads really well into the final set of questions I had about grief, heartbrokenness, and writing. You kind of say in that book, it's a beautiful book, Read the Heartbroken, that heartbrokenness is actually an essential part of revolutionary consciousness, because we have to be heartbroken in order to kind of understand that we need to build something new. And you kind of look at the Kubler-Ross, the psychologist, kind of become part pop psychology, the stages of grief, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, shock, testing. But you look at it as a way more about understanding how grief works rather than trying to fix it or to try to make meaning out of it. And you say that we can't build a better world without being heartbroken. The heartbreak is a break from some sort, from the kind of life we're currently living, and that collective heartbreak can be a new kind of class consciousness. So can you say a bit about that? I'm just trying to think whether, also that's the first part of the question about the role of heartbreak in class consciousness. But the second thing is writing, because we've talked before about the way that you write that book, which is not academic, it's not a typical academic book, you don't do references, etc. It's more about prose writing. That we, in this stage of resistance, in a way, we need different forms of writing. Maybe you could say a bit about that, how you've approached that.
I don't know if I can say those things, but I really want to say this, because Josh has never heard me say this. Really, I write that first Read the Heartbroken piece after I had a conversation with you about some set of people you'd had to sit with, and about what it's like to sit with people who've lived through state violence. So thank you very much for that. I've never got a chance to rep you in person before about it. Josh is the beautiful young man with the beautiful baby. Everyone should turn now and coo. So I say only partly in jest that I think heartbreak is Heartbrokenness is the class consciousness of racial capitalism. And it is only partly in jest, because I think the thing I was describing earlier about the ways in which the analytic framework of racial capitalism as it lives in movements is an opening of people to each other, of what many forms of violence are, of a kind of comprehension of what it is to see others' lives and to see the wreckage of violence through them and still be together. I think we see that in every organising space that I come across now, and I think even if it is not the thing, it is the thing before the thing. And I think that's what I think class consciousness is like. In terms of writing, I don't love that book. I know a lot of people read it short and know it's easier, isn't it? But it's not the one I don't know. I think you have to try everything. You have to try every single thing. That's what I think. And often I write academic books, not really ever thinking of an audience, but because I have not worked that thing out myself, that I like the pleasure of working out the thing I've not yet understood. And then when I've worked it out, then I'm able to tell other people about it. I don't have to read the book. Once I've worked it out, I can tell you the précis, and that's probably the bit of it. I think other forms of writing, I can see, even though that was a different piece of writing, it's done something for other people, and that I very much appreciate, that other people have run with it in terms of what that would then mean in terms of their political project. And that, all making is like that, isn't it? If you make stuff to say, here's my lovely thing, I think you're not understood what the human potential of making things that others see is.
Okay, thank you, Gargi. I think at this point, perhaps we've got, I think, about 15 minutes or 10 minutes for some questions from the, so if you raise your hand. There's one at the back already. Yeah.
Sorry, can you?
Sure. There's one at the back, but a bit smooth.
No.
Thank you for fascinating discourse. I was interested in what you were saying, Professor, about being in love with our racialized selves. And my question is, according to what identity construct? Because if we're going to be choosing what's on the table at the moment, that's from a colonial perspective. Are we going to be creating new constructs individually or collectively? Or do we have to take what is on the table, so to speak?
No, I really hear what you're saying, that of course, there's no framing of race without that long history of violence. But long ago, I had a conversation with a friend of mine, which I said, well, all of our the idea of blackness and of brownness it's just all colonial stuff. And he said, that doesn't exhaust it. And I kind of think, it's tricky, isn't it? It is an imposition, and yet it's the imposition that many generations have made their own, survived with, but has crevices which are the crevices of disguise, of privacy, of intra-community activity. And all of that, I don't want to give colonialism that power to say that every texture of my life and my sense of self is that. Yet equally, I don't think that there is any texture of how we come to ourselves that is not also already racialized. Because, it can't step outside of history. So in those ways, I think there's something about the racialized self is always in the process of being remade and adapted, even if it is an external imposition. And I think, I just don't think there's a way around that. And also I think a political project that doesn't register the different ways in which we are in love with ourselves can't go forward, because what is the dream of freedom apart from that which comes from the ways that we are in love with ourselves and others? It might be my limitation, but that's what I think for now.
Question? I'm sure there are.
raise your hand.
You're allowed to make a comment.
Thank you. Hi, thank you so much. It's really, really interesting, fascinating what you're saying. It was just a couple of things that came to my mind. I mean, Professor, what do you think about the role of activism in all of this? Because you mentioned about, a series of intellectual, changes that we need to go through to find possible solutions. So how does activism work with that? And also, is there a danger with intellectualizing approaches that we might be excluding certain groups of people from what you're saying is collaborative project?
Okay, I'll start with the second thing. So I don't think everyone has to read the same books or write the same essays, but I think understanding the world is part of the broader collective project of how you change the world. I don't think we know what politics to do, where, how, when, without some set of people thinking what the powerful doing. And it might be that some of that is not primetime TV stuff. And I think that's okay, as long as the bits that matter move between spaces. And we've already said that actually the real motoring force behind debates around racial capitalism have been street movements. Yeah, it's that comes from movements. That's why academics are taking it up. It doesn't first get resurrected from the academy. It gets resurrected from global movement for Black lives and how that gets taken up elsewhere as a framing for abolitionist politics everywhere. And that's a movement that says, actually, we can't understand this beast without an analysis of capitalism. And this is the analysis of capitalism we want to put forward. In terms of activity, I'm trying to say that I think activism is choosing what to do to hide from the powerful or hurt them or escape most of the time. And to do that, we need to know who, how, what, where the powerful are. It's the same argument again. Again, I don't think everyone has to be doing that work, and it needs to be shared in many different ways. But I don't want to go for accessibility if then we all lose, which is possible. Yeah, plenty of examples of that. Don't think our enemies are simple. They're not. Also, someone stop calling me professor. It's ridiculous. It's like my mother's in the room taking the pee.
Hey, Gargi. I have a question in formation, but it's kind of jumping off of what you just said about activism and where you ended. A lot of what you write, a lot of the texts that have been spoken about today, but also your book about austerity and earlier stuff, you're really contending with this idea of regimes of violence will expand, the nets expand, and who gets, trawled along into this expense. And it makes me think a lot about this quote from Mike Davis, or this, I think he wrote something called "Who Will Build the Ark?" And I think your work really helps us think about who and who will build the ark. So I'm interested in, that building of the ark, but specifically that thing about consciousness, class consciousness, heartbrokenness, consciousness under racial capitalism, activism, and we're in an educational establishment. I guess my question is, what inspires you, or where do you think we can draw hope from in terms of projects of developing consciousness amongst, dispossessed peoples, proletariat, all of those different people who are abandoned? How do we do that at scale with pace that meets the kind of heightened, degradation of the world? Like, how do we do that a bit more effectively? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know the answer to that, though. That's why I write all this stuff, isn't it? Yeah. But I think you're right. That's the question, isn't it? And it's interesting that another thing I said when I came here is that I want to do a version of, a response to Mike Davis of Who Will Build the Ark with people who build. And again, I wasn't here long enough, but we could still do it even though I'm at one remove, because I do think that a helpful way to frame the question about, you know, what is it we're trying to build, with whom, who has these kinds of capacities, what are they together? But the real question you're saying is at scale and at pace, and that is the one I don't know. You know, from how we know each other, that I don't despair about the ability of humans to understand what is going on, because every day I meet all kinds of humans and I converse with all kinds of humans, not only academics, who absolutely understand what is going on. So that's the bit, even though it's because of disaster, it really heartens me in my political lifetime, because not all of my political lifetime was like that. I don't feel like through the 80s and 90s in this country that many people would kind of, if you said, look, this is a kind of a global crisis and the wreckage of your life is linked to the wreckage there. So, yeah, absolutely. Now you go to any bus stop, people know, lots of people know. They might not all use quite the same language, but there's a kind of, turning point, this can't go on. I cannot make it to the end of the week, and that is linked to that the planet can't make it to the end of the decade. But people got it. But at scale and at pace, that's about organisational form, how we imagine politics, what we think politics does. It comes back to my irritation with the idea that politics is making the better argument. That's an irritation with myself, because my own training is discursive. So you just pin the ideas down and put them forward persuasively. Someone, not me, who has power, will do something. This kind of, I knew that wasn't the case when I was 20. Why am I still doing it in my 50s? It's stupid. It's only stupidity that could bring me to that power. But we must have a register of politics which is about remaking the world together. Now, that might be a range of things, but I don't know the key question you're asking. Quickly enough for less of us to die. We're failing every day. We've failed every day, haven't we? I have that sick feeling of failure every waking minute, and then most people I know have it as well. But apart from starting to say it to each other, I don't know. That must be the collaborative project, mustn't it? Cheerful now, isn't it?
I'll try not to be too optimistic, but just...
Yeah, understand, read the room, mate.
Going back to your list of 4 bullet points, borders, prisons, debt, the first 3, I think these are areas that we feel maybe least able to influence. They're a done deal. Debt just digs us deeper into capitalism. It kind of closes off all the escape routes. So if we take capitalism as a form of exploitation, if it's interchangeable with exploitation, then can we not leverage that concept through the platforms, the 4th bullet point? If we're choosing our platforms, and if we are elevating and devaluing platforms according to future values, the future world, who's on the ark and who isn't, then could that be an avenue to something better than what we have now, which is clearly just not working? It's worse than a broken model. Just thinking about...
Okay, I think all 4 of them are possible avenues to a better model, but none of them are avenues to a better model by thinking that any one of us will make individual choices. So this is about an anti-capitalism that I can imagine has to be collective, collaborative, as Josh has said, at scale and at pace. That's what it takes to unmake a machine that is killing us all. So it isn't. So I'm uninterested in different consumer choices unless they're linked to other kind of collective movements. I don't think that many of the ways in which I don't think you can step out of it, because I'm raised in that kind of Marxism. I think even if I think it's too constrained, I think that is the world. But I do think we will only survive if we find a way to band together to ameliorate these forms of violence. And I think, the prize is there, isn't it? And as I've said, lots of people, including people who, if I really said to them, sound like a communist to me, would give me a slap. And yet, people are talking together about why an economic system of ever-escalating growth, of extreme inequality, of extractivism from natural resources and human resources, of a degradation of all landscapes, of a misuse of all natural resources, that cannot go on. Some of those people never think about capitalism, but they do think that world cannot go on. So we need a kind of political vehicle that is not a lobbying vehicle, because that's the thing about anti-capitalism doesn't say, we'll argue the ruling class out of their class position. It says, we will seize the means of production. So we need to think, what is the equivalent of seizing the machine which is killing us for our moment? Again, I don't know the answer to that, but I'm heartened that so many different people want to have that conversation now, because I think that's not the thing, but the thing before the thing. Time for snacks. Never time. So hopeful.
Sorry, Gargi, but can I just take issue with the point you made about
art? Just say the thing about art.
I'm going to say yes, because you said about art being fun. Oh yeah, I have fun too. And I just wanted to take issue with that, because if we think about the arts and the humanities, which are the basis for the intellectual and creative thought that you're saying is so key to how we approach and challenge these structures, I really appreciated the response that you gave about the importance of not making things too accessible, etc. Surely if we see the way that arts and humanities are under systemic attack, both in terms of rhetoric, but also materially, isn't it precisely because art does pose a huge threat to the very system that you're saying that we should be trying to destroy? I mean, art is the means through which, as individuals, we have these, on a personal level, these transcendental moments of meaning, or experiencing a meaning in life and of our own lives, and also through art connect to others. And I think that coming to consciousness also that Josh was talking about comes through connecting to art, seeing ourselves reflected in art, and also having these moments which are so few and far between in life, precisely because we live in which a system is constantly trying to deaden that experience in us and that capacity to reach those deep places within us, which I think is how we connect to ourselves and then to others. So when I think about the struggle, I think we do it in order to have more of those moments, to ensure that others have them too, and have the, we address systemic inequality so that others can also make their art and have these deeply transformational moments of connecting and feeling. They're so few and far between in life, and I think it's because of this. It's not just fun. That's what
well, you see, but I would say what you're describing is fun, but and you're not describing movement building or dismantling capitalism. You're saying moments of connection with self, which I absolutely think, yeah, of course you need those things, but I don't think you can have them to the exclusion of building the arc. So that's what I'm saying. I also think this is just, I know you don't think this, but I'm desperate to say this to people everywhere. Just because the other side attacks us doesn't mean that that thing was the right thing to do. Because partly how the other side coordinates its attacks is also them deciding for us where we put our attention and decisions. And I think you can see that happening in universities now. Because we're being so attacked, forms of learning that we would never defend in any other circumstance, suddenly you have to go and defend them and think, oh no, of course people lose their jobs. But this is not the thing. No, I don't want people to lose their jobs. But if I'm going to imagine a liberatory learning, most of what happens in UK universities obviously isn't it. Everyone who works in UK universities knows this obviously isn't it. And yet, people should have their jobs. Of course they should have their jobs. So it's like, and because the attack paints us into a corner, it limits the space for critical remaking, doesn't it? It's designed to do that. So, I just think the experience of transcendence cannot take up all the space away from what collaborative making is. So that's the point. Still not smooth.
Just one.
Sorry.
It's just a little suggestion, and I'm not sure, how we're going to take. I don't have any answers, but one of the things that I know is that, first of all, art is very generalistically put out. I think as artists, you talk about heartbreak, and I'm just wondering if the heartbreak is about kind of taking away these desensitized individuals or communities. And I think art or artists do have a role in terms of sensitizing the issues, working with image, working with text, putting it together, and organizing ourselves as well, as artists, and just being in these kind of spaces. I think is a good way of going forward for artists, at least. So this is kind of my way of thinking. Perhaps this is one of the things we need to work on as artists, to sensitize people, to really kind of, because we've been desensitized for many, many years through film, photography, TV, all the media. So we kind of lost that kind of connections with ourselves, with the images that are put in front of us. So I think maybe one of the things that artists can work towards is to recreate those kind of spaces. Right?
No, I absolutely agree, and that's fine. Yeah, I don't mean there should be no art. I just think art is not a substitute for building the arc. That's really what, and I think, I guess that has been my experience at UAL, that many colleagues think they are building the arc when they are doing things on their own. Think they're going to find themselves dead, all of us. That's what I mean.
So we build the art without art.
Oh no, let's have them snacks.
I'd like to thank you for the brilliant questions, by the way. And multiple thank you to Gargi for wonderful, generous sharing.
Oh, yes. And thank you so much for hosting, Paul, and for doing the converse.
Drinks, snacks.
Thank you.